Welcome back, everyone, to our second presentation of Fatty Acid Symposium, our first annual symposium presented by the Fatty Acid Research Institute and OmegaQuant. Dr. Jeff Hielson is a major and a registered dietitian serving in the U.S. Army and the research director within the Nutrition Services Department at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. His research focuses on long-chain omega-3 fatty acid supplementation in the context of skeletal muscle. He's been involved in a lot of different papers. I've seen him present numerous times. He's got other research and publications in the world of omega-3 and concussion, which will not be discussed today. So if this is an area of fitness you're interested, he's got a lot of different areas that he can publish. So Jeff, thank you so much for being here today and presenting.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I appreciate the opportunity to be able to present today. My presentation's topic will be long-chain omega-3 fatty acids, looking at skeletal muscle mass and function as the primary outcomes. And it's titled Leveraging the Strength of Omega-3 Fatty Acids. All right, so my general disclaimer, that my views are my own. So today I'm going to take you through a very brief history or research history of omega-3 research in the context of muscle health and function. Briefly talk about the omega-3 index. You've probably heard multiple presentations regarding that index. And I'll talk about just general population, military personnel, and athletes, and some of the difference that we see in the amount of EPA and DHA in the blood. Then we'll review the actual evidence looking at omega-3 supplementation and its effect on strength and function. And finally, we'll end with another strength, which is the strength of the evidence, and we'll talk about some of the issues and questions and concerns involving that with omega-3 research. So plausible mechanisms. So really, I would say over the past few years, there have been a number of reports in cell systems, preclinical mammalian models, as well as humans demonstrating a positive influence of EPA and DHA intake on skeletal muscle. And most of those have been related to supplementation, not necessarily eating more fish, because it's a lot easier to supplement. And of course, with cells, you actually have to use a concentration of EPA and DHA. So the notion that EPA and DHA intake may affect skeletal muscle has really garnered a lot of attention recently. And not only because skeletal muscle mass and strength are important in promoting metabolic health and longevity, but it's really the maintenance of skeletal muscle mass and strength throughout life is really a key determinant of human health and well-being, and really underscores this concept of healthy aging, as in a greater quality of life. So omega-3s may really indicate that. And some of the mechanisms are listed here. Skeletal muscle protein turnover, omega-3 intake has been shown to have anti-inflammatory properties, mitochondrial function, neuromuscular adaptations, and of course, actions with insulin. And so I'm going to walk you through some of the evidence looking more so at the skeletal muscle turnover, and we can basically piece together the story with cells and human models combined. So if we look at the omega-3 intake, this is just a small, and definitely don't get bogged down by the details, but this illustrates, just outlines important cellular and molecular mechanisms involved with omega-3 intake. And a more drilled down version is what you see here. If you look at the screen, you can actually see this mTORC-C. Really what this is one of the, we'll call it a cellular signaling network that plays a crucial role in regulating various processes. Most importantly for us today is that it helps stimulate protein synthesis and with nutrient intake. So with that being said, omega-3, where you see leucine coming in, there is a potential application of omega-3 when you have EPA and DHA enrichment actually can help activate or downregulate, depending on the study. We'll go over that. Different types of kinases. So you look at PKB, P70S6K. Those are different kinases that can be upregulated and downregulated to change muscle protein turnover. So it affects the balance of synthesis and breakdown. And so really that's what we're discussing when we talk about muscle protein synthesis. But there's also a breakdown side. If you look at 4 here, there's also different ways that EPA and DHA can actually decrease muscle breakdown. So let's go and dive into some of the cell literature looking at that. So this is one of the most classical studies that probably has been cited almost every study involved in this. It's a paper from 2013, and it shows that the incorporation of EPA and DHA into the muscle phospholipid membrane upregulates anabolic signaling. But most importantly, is that EPA was actually the main driver of this effect. In fact, EPA, muscle protein synthesis, was 25% greater in the EPA condition. Moving forward, we find that EPA also led to a greater decrease in breakdown by approximately 25%. So for the longest time, and I know in my research, I focus primarily on supplementation with EPA due to the fact that some of the early cell studies, and this isn't the only one, this is just the most popular, um, tended to favor EPA as one of the most potent um, drivers of protein synthesis and breakdown in cells. Well, a more recent study that just got published, I believe late last year, found that both EPA and DHA actually led to a reduction in protein degradation or breakdown. However, it was more pronounced with DHA. And not only that, though, if you look at the triangle, for example, here, that shows EPA, we find that the range of an effect is much tighter with EPA, whereas there's a greater range of effect with DHA, meaning that almost regardless of the concentration used in this study, there was a positive influence on breakdown, i.e., less protein breakdown. And the authors stated that a lot of this was mediated by PPAR, which was something I showed you in a previous slide for the breakdown component of it, and that it was about 2 times higher in DHA and about 1.3 times higher in EPA. So that's probably why this is occurring. So really, EPA and DHA could be having that effect. Now, something that's kind of interesting, and I'm not going to get too much into it, but what we do know is that a lot of these effects are because EPA and DHA get incorporated into the muscle tissue. So this study clearly showed that in their cells, more EPA plus DHA equals greater incorporation. However, they had 3 separate groups. HC was the high group, LC was the low group, and what you can see here is that muscle protein synthesis was actually highest at a lower concentration. Because as you can see from the previous slide as well, for the breakdown component, it could be mediated partially by that. But it is important to note that more is not always better. So we still haven't quite figured out exactly what is the appropriate dose to use. Now, keep in mind, this is in cells. And one of the not an issue, but one of the things to take into account with cell studies is that they can range in concentration from 1 to 750 micromoles, and the incubation rates range from 6 hours to 72 hours. So it's very difficult to translate these data into human. However, we do have human studies that have been accomplished here. And so let's go over some of the most important studies that have been done in humans. This is a study from 2011. This is by far, I call it the seminal paper in humans, and I think most researchers would agree. There was 9 individuals in this study, healthy, and this is in young individuals, by the way. And we find that 8 weeks of supplementation of about 3.36 grams of EPA plus DHA, slightly favoring EPA. If you look over here to the right where it says basal and clamp, they use the hyperinsulinemic clamp in order to create an anabolic environment. So at the basal rate, we do expect it to go up. So this is without any type of supplementation. Whenever we actually supplement, what we find is that in a nutrient or a protein-fed state, adding omega-3s seem to increase the effect of muscle protein synthesis, as you can see here by the AB. So moving forward to another study, or excuse me, this is the same study. This is a kinase that where they believe the effect came from. So there's mTOR, the actual measure of muscle protein synthesis here. And then you have these kinases. And then again, once that with the clamp and omega-3 supplementation, you have an even greater increase in muscle protein synthesis. So it augments protein feeding. And moving forward, one thing that's really interesting to note is that they actually found that the effect on muscle protein synthesis was not related to any anti-inflammatory mechanisms that they were able to detect. This is from a McGlory 2014. If you look at this first section here, from 0 to 4 weeks, we have a slight increase in skeletal muscle EPA and DHA, which is often not reported because you have to do biopsies. And what they found was that there was a steady increase over time, which is something you want to see. And then also with that, if you look past week 2, what they found, which that was the anything past week 2, they actually found that there was a significant increase in mTOR and focal adhesion kinase. So again, another kinase that's involved in these processes. So the issue with those studies is that they weren't necessarily physiologically relevant because you're not going to be hooked up to a clamp that actually provides an anabolic environment. So McGlory in 2016 tested this directly. He had 20 resistance-trained young men, and they had 2 separate groups, 5 grams per day of fish oil, which was 3.5 grams of EPA and 0.9 grams of DHA, which was about 8 weeks. And they also did a combination. So they tested in combination with protein feeding by itself, and then the combination of feeding 30 grams of protein plus exercise to see if fish oil was able to augment each effect. So what they found was that there was not a significant effect in and of itself. Feeding, for example, did lead to an increase of muscle protein synthesis. Feeding plus exercise, there was an even greater increase in muscle protein synthesis. So the results were not significantly in favor of fish oil. But I do want to point out what's really important to note is if you take all the percent increase data that we have from the previous studies, we have 2 Smith studies and then both groups from McGlory, the range and increase in muscle protein synthesis is about 30 to 100%. And again, it's kind of interesting that in older individuals, we have an even greater response to fish oil than even compared to the young individuals. So that's the data I showed you a couple slides ago. So a more recent study came out looking at muscle protein synthesis, and this study also agreed that there is an increase, and it's essentially a dose response as well. So with 2 grams of EPA plus DHA, you have about a 10% decrease in muscle protein breakdown, and then a 13% lower increase with 3.5 grams as well. And then you also have a stepwise increase in synthesis, in net protein synthesis. So it's pretty interesting that we have similar results. Now, this study is specifically in COPD patients, so they are a clinical population, but it is interesting to see the trend overall. Of course, one of the best ways for us to determine the overall effect of multiple different studies is to look at a meta-analysis. So recently, there was a meta-analysis published on this specific question. If you look here, this first box in the top is looking at very specific type of muscle protein synthesis, and the one down here at the bottom is looking at muscle-specific protein synthesis. The one in the bottom is looking at whole body protein synthesis. So those are 2 very different concepts. If you look at the diamond, since the diamond crosses this intersection, this perpendicular line here, that means it is not significant. However, if you look at whole body protein, muscle protein synthesis, we do find that there is a significant effect favoring omega-3 and 0.51. You're like, well, what does this 0.51 mean? Well, this just tells us that it's essentially a moderate effect for increasing muscle protein synthesis. Now, you do have to take this with a little bit of a grain of salt because it's only based off 3 observations, and that's something important to note, but at least gives us a good indication that there is data out there that suggests that whole body protein synthesis is influenced by omega-3 supplementation. Now, this is great and all, the mechanisms are great, but outcomes are by far the most important thing. And before we even get to outcomes, we really need to set the stage for, is omega-3 index or intake an issue in populations? Because if it's not an issue, if everyone has high omega-3 levels, then there's really not a lot of benefit for us to study this. So let's go ahead and get into that. Probably one of the most famous slides ever put together, or pictures ever put together, was the 2016 study by Stark and colleagues. And they basically looked at all the data, and they essentially found that a large majority of countries that outside the coast, that were inside that have most of their landmass not a coast, had poor omega-3 levels. Basically anything below 8%, right? And so in the United States, it was 4% or less. Canada was 4% or less. And most of the westernized countries were not above 6%. And this was in data from 2016. So there's an updated review looking at this. And what they found is that across the board, except for one country, every country had improved omega-3 index levels. Their hypothesis is that it's mostly due to supplementation, they make a really good case on why that may be. And of course, for the westernized countries as well, maybe more awareness could be it, but there's really no evidence for that. But we do have increased amounts of supplementations in the pool as well. So again, the United States, for example, and Canada, and Mexico, and most of the Western countries are still at an omega-3 index that's 6% or less. But what's really interesting is we pulled data looking at athletes and military personnel. And we assumed that it would be very similar to whatever population that they're living with at the time. But what we found was much different. If you look at athletes, for example, it's very difficult to ascertain by just looking directly at this and getting a full number. But the overall pooled omega-3 index from all of these studies was 4.43%. So just over that 4% threshold and nowhere near that 6%. We would like to see them ideally above 8. And as you can see, there's a multiple cohorts out of these that are actually below the 4% level. So we looked at data in military personnel. In military personnel, the data was much worse, given that the pooled mean omega-3 index was only 3.18%. Very, very low. So below the 4% range. So if we do a direct comparison using the updated data that from the updated global map of omega-3 index, we find that most westernized countries range between are closer to 5 in reality. So in athletes, again, it was 4.4%. And in military, it was on average 3.1%. 3.2%, excuse me. So very, very low. So there are certain subgroups that are very low omega-3, and those are some of the subgroups that we really want them to have adequate omega-3 index levels, especially pending whatever skeletal muscle data we find. So let's get into that. So what does the outcome data actually show? So we conducted a systematic review back in 2019, trying to put all the data together that looks at the promotion and preservation of lean body mass, strength, and recovery. So if you look at lean body mass, we found that there was very unclear data on whether or not omega-3s can actually promote the increase in lean body mass in healthy individuals. Similar to strength, the promotion of strength at that time in 2019, it wasn't very clear if omega-3s had an influence on that. And so we wanted to conduct some studies, starting with cross-sectional studies, looking at single point times and blood levels of EPA and DHA to determine if there's any relationship. So what we found in our study was that there was a relationship between EPA specifically and hand grip strength. And I know in athletes, hand grip strength is not often used, but we used it in this study for just ease of use and access to the players. But what's interesting is we did not find any cross-sectional or observational association with lean body mass, fat mass, or power based on squat jump or counter movement jump. So we did the same thing in military. We wanted to look at blood levels of omega-3 and the Army Combat Fitness Test, which the Army Combat Fitness Test is relatively new, and it involves 6 events: the 3 repetition maximum deadlift, the standing power throw, the hand release push up, the sprint drag carry. And this shows the leg tuck, because when I conducted the study, it was a mixture of leg tuck and also the plank, and then the 2-mile run. So those are the events. Currently today, it's the plank. There is no leg tuck. But what we found was that omega-3, or well, not omega-3, actually, it was specifically, once again, EPA was correlated, small correlation with strength, and moderately correlated with power movements. And if you look the isometric strength movement, which is the same thing as the hand grip strength, there was a large effect with the plank, which is pretty interesting. And what that tells us is that isometric it's not complex. And so the omega-3 is having some kind of muscle level effect, specifically in our data, EPA. So how about older adults? And again, this is looking only at cross-sectional data, not interventional data. This is a recent systematic review and meta-analysis, and they found that dietary, so not supplementation necessarily, but dietary omega-3 was significantly associated with lower risk of sarcopenia or incidence of sarcopenia. And as you can see here, the overall was 0.41, which is a small effect. And then there was a recent study that was published in 2023 that found that omega-3 index and DHA was actually associated with lean body mass. ALM is appendicular lean body mass. That includes just the limbs. And then hand grip strength there was no correlation at all with that. Steps per day were higher with a higher omega-3 index and higher EPA, so that was a function measure. And then also there was a survey that they conducted, which was a quality of life in sarcopenia. And they found that there was a positive correlation with higher levels of omega-3 index and higher quality of life. That was mediated also, there was a higher DHA. As you can see, there was a moderate effect, or excuse me, a small effect with EPA as well. No, excuse me, that is a moderate effect for 0.402, but it was not significant. So what about the interventional studies? So you can find a lot of things in correlations, but you can't really infer anything from them. So it's important to look at randomized controlled trials, if possible, to determine if there is an influence of, in this case, omega-3s on any kind of outcomes that we care about, which is strength and muscle mass. And so we employed a resistance training protocol to try to investigate this. So we did a 10-week resistance training protocol. Our participants worked out 3 days per week doing a full body resistance training exercise, which you see on the far right. And during this, we did 1 rep max testing in the bench press and back squat at the start and at the very end of the intervention. We conducted a DEXA scan for body composition analysis. And then we also did omega-3 testing at week 0 and week 10 as well. Supplements were distributed every 2 weeks in order for us to have more of a consistent relationship with them, where they're bringing in their supplements and we're giving them theirs, because it will remind them to continue to take them. And we did send them email reminders to ensure that they took their supplements. And then they let us know if they missed anything. Our compliance was rather good. Moving on. And the dose, of course, the dose of omega-3 was pretty substantial. It was a 4 grams of fish oil, slightly over 4 grams of fish oil, but for EPA plus DHA, it was 3.85. So pretty substantial, slightly higher in EPA content. Looking at the nutritional analysis from pre to post, no change in any variables at all, which is good. We want them to just consistently keep their diet about the same. we actually asked them to decrease their omega-3 intake because they're, we were having them take the supplement. Also, in order to be a part of the study, they had to eat fish less than twice per week, which was pretty easy in Texas, to be honest with you, unfortunately. Um, and we look at the compliance for the supplement. It was very high compliance, 94.6% in the fish oil group. Resistant training protocol. So if you missed any, there was a certain number you could not miss, or you would have to be withdrawn from the trial. We had very high compliance with the resistance training protocol. And if you look at blinding, so 60% is the number of individuals, or the percent of individuals that were not able to guess their supplement correctly. So that's really good. So we expect it to be around 50%. And so that says, we probably had a decent blinding. But of course, the gold standard for omega-3 research for any type of compliance measure is definitely going to be red blood cell or whole blood omega-3 status that you can determine the omega-3 index through. So as you can see here, pre to post in the placebo group, there was relatively no change in the omega-3 index. However, in the fish oil group, there was a substantial change here. In fact, our baseline level was around 4.6, and it got up to over 10% as the average. We had a couple stragglers here. Just know these stragglers, the lowest percent increase we had was just over 2%. The next person, the next lowest person was actually around 5%. So we had one person that did not respond or did not quite tell the truth about their supplement. I don't want to go too far into that. So as you can see here, the placebo EPA slightly went up, DHA went down, overall omega-3 index stayed the same, 1.3%. And in the fish oil group, it went up by 109.7%. So more than double. Of course, when you're doing resistance training protocols, you want to ensure volume is similar between groups as well. And what we found, they were similar. And one very interesting note was that it was slightly higher in the placebo group, but it was not significant at all. So if you look at the main outcomes, we had some very interesting findings. We found that fish oil supplementation did lead to a significantly higher, a significantly higher bench press and a significantly higher 1 rep max bench and squats when it's relative to body weight, which I'll show you some of that here in just a minute. There was no significant difference in lean body mass. And there was an interesting finding that there was about a 1 kilogram difference in fat mass, but it was not significant between groups. So if we look here, if you see here, there's the relative 1 rep max bench press here as a group. This is placebo. Everybody significantly increased overall for the group means. But for the fish oil, it increased to a higher extent in both the bench press and the squat. Because if we look at just the quote unquote regular data, i.e. absolute number of pounds lifted, there was no difference in the squat. But when we look at relative to body weight, and the reason why we did that is because part of the argument for why this may work is that even in young individuals, any fat infiltration in the muscle could be a negative thing. And so whenever you have omega-3 supplementation and you're lifting weights, that goes away. And so you actually have greater strength of the muscle mass that you have. And so that's where the relative comes in. So what's interesting to note, I showed you a single study. So once again, you want to make sure you look at all the evidence. So what we found, this is from the International Society of Sports Nutrition Position Stand that was recently published. I want to say it was right at a month now on long-chain omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acids. And they found related to muscle mass and strength that omega-3 supplementation may not confer a muscle hypertrophic benefit in young individuals, but in combination with resistance training, it may actually improve strength in a dose and duration dependent manner, which is an important finding. But what's interesting is, are these really unique? Well, no. I mean, if we look here, so this is based off the studies that were annotated in the position stand. These graphs are not in the position stand, but I went ahead and I took the treatment effect of each study and I put the dose, right? So what we find is that there is no relationship when we look at fat-free mass. But if we look at the strength component, it's really interesting that there is a very strong relationship between the dose and the treatment effect, or how big of a difference we had compared to a placebo. And that tells us, the treatment effect tells us that there is a true effect. Now, again, keep in mind, this isn't like this isn't a meta-analysis, so it's not the highest level of evidence, but it does provide some decent guidance for us that omega-3 supplementation may help with strength. Now, all of the studies that I've showed you so far that are interventional have been in young individuals. So it's important to note, what about the older individuals? Well, one of the most classic studies looking at this was a Smith 2015 6-month intervention, 3.36 grams of EPA plus DHA. There was no exercise component. They had 44 participants, which is pretty substantial, especially because they were using things like MRI, for example, to measure thigh muscle volume, which, if you're measuring muscle mass, MRI really is the true criterion standard. I mean, that's really what you want to measure. And what they found based on their 6-month trial was that fish oil supplementation increased thigh muscle volume, hand grip strength, and 1 rep max strength without an exercise component. So again, is this a single finding? Let's look at the evidence. So these are all the meta-analyses that have been conducted looking at strength, muscle mass, or muscle function in any capacity, whether it's older or younger individuals, with and without. And I do have some notes here on the side as well. But if you see here, if we were to put all these studies together, what it finds is that most of the studies report no change in muscle mass with omega-3 supplementation compared to a placebo. Strength greatly favors, as in out of 10 trials, 7 reported significant increases in strength with fish oil supplementation or omega-3 supplementation. Some did not use fish oil, some were krill. And then muscle function is the most equivocal, in that of the 6 trials that looked at function, half and half reported no effect or a positive effect. Now, so everything's sounding really good right now, but I wanted to be very clear. There's another strength that I wanted to talk about related to this topic, is the strength or quality of the evidence. Because one thing that we found throughout our studies is that there may be an issue with design quality when it comes to these types of trials. This is a phenomenal study that I worked on with a group in Australia. The lead author is Ryan Anthony. He's published extensively on omega-3s, and of course, some legends in the field, Peter McLennan, Gregory Peoples, and McCartney as well. They wanted to look at the design quality in studies. There have been some studies in the past that have looked at design quality in cardiovascular research, but they specifically wanted to look at physically trained individuals. And what they found was, overall, there were a lot of notable gaps and design flaws that should be shored up in omega-3 research. To include, there was no clear mechanistic hypothesis for omega-3, leading to substantial differences in dose and duration. It was almost like you playing darts, you're throwing it at a board. And then there was also an inadequate assessment of the background diet. So what are people eating behind the scenes? Because of course we know one issue with omega-3 trials, specifically related to supplementation, is that in the diet, you absolutely can get omega-3s. And not only that, though, omega-6s may influence how the response to omega-3s. So there's a lot of different things to take into account. Also, there really was, interestingly, a low number of studies that reported blood marker assessment, or maybe didn't have a full understanding based on the read of a publication of those assessment markers, as in, why should we use plasma versus another tissue? So what came out of this paper, it was a custom 5-point scale that was used in a previous review that they conducted in exercise in muscle damage studies was there are 5 crucial points we need to make whenever we look at the quality of different studies. And looking at this 5-point scale, one is exclusion of participants with baseline EPA and DHA levels above a certain threshold. Because obviously, if someone has an omega-3 index that's already high, say 8%, well, if we provide them with more omega-3s, we don't have a good justification that an already saturated tissue is going to physiologically change. And then number 2, whether supplementation resulted in a change in membrane EPA plus DHA. Because if there wasn't a significant change, did you test? Are you actually testing the effect of omega-3s? And then 3, exclusion of participants that consumed, of course, N3 supplements. You'd be surprised, but that's a lot of that is not excluded. 4, the exclusion of participants consuming more than 1 fish meal per week. And then a minimum supplement dosing duration of 4 weeks. And using this custom 5-point scale, you can easily determine the quality of studies. For example, if you look at Anthony's 2021 review, this most recent review that I just mentioned, and then also the ISM position stand looking at the muscle, the body composition and strength studies, the quality scores out of 5 were 1.5, 1.5, and 2.0. Very low. And, some of these things are very minimal, as in, like, for example, 2 of them should be gimmies, as in, hey, you're about to enter a supplementation trial. You should not have been taking omega-3 supplements, and you should not be eating a lot of fish. And a lot didn't even measure that, because that's where your 2 points could come from. So it's important to use this type of scale, even though we have like other ways to assess study quality. For example, like the Cochrane has a really good way. Pedro, for example, is another one. We need one specific to omega-3 studies so that people can help in their design process when they're putting together these studies, and on the back end for us to assess them after they've already been completed. So I wanted to also illustrate. So this is a recent study, and this study was not included in the graph that I showed you, and there's a reason for that. This was recently published in the past month or so. It looked at track and field athletes, and it was a long trial, 8 weeks long, high dose supplementation, 3.84 grams of EPA plus DHA. And then their 2 primary measures was hand grip strength and event improvement. So I guess they had different types of track and field athletes, so they used event improvement over time. So from a study quality, you're like, okay, everything looks fine. But if we look at placebo, there was an increase in the left-handed hand grip strength by 3.8, that's kilograms. And then right hand grip strength went down slightly, and their event improvement went down almost by 2 placements. Then Fishwell, we had a very small increase in hand grip strength in the left hand. In the right hand, we actually had the exact same number decrease in the right hand. And then we had almost a 1 event improvement with Fishwell. Now, it might be interesting to note, well, Fishwell obviously isn't working here. Placebo vastly outperformed on the left hand grip strength. But the first thing I go to is, what was the dose and duration, which we already know. So what did the paper actually state? The paper stated that there was an increase in percent EPA, DHA, and omega-3 index in those that were taking a Fishwell, which that isn't appropriate. So there was a significant effect. But we also have to think about, was it a meaningful effect despite significance? And let me illustrate this. So we can actually, it's not necessarily easy, but, based on EPA dose and duration, as you see here in the bottom, we can reasonably predict the expected omega-3 response. And you see across this line, these are 5 different studies in 105 individuals, I believe, what I have graphed here. And using published data from Smith 2015 as an example, a previous study that I just discussed, they reported that their pre-post omega-3 index, it was 5.8%, and it went up to 13.2%. That's substantial. when I plug that information into this equation, what I find is that the predicted should have been 12.3%. And that's adjusting for, it was actually 13.1%, which was almost exactly. But because they noted their compliance was 93.6%, I added that to the equation and we came up with 12.3. So relatively close, within 1%, we're able to gauge about how well athletes could potentially comply. So when I looked at the numbers in this study, I was a little surprised because what we find is that the expected increase, so this is based on this equation here, the line of the equation, was 5.15%. Because again, they were doing a relatively high dose over 8 weeks. Now, based on compliance, so they reported that compliance was 80.3% in their cohort. So knocking that number down based on compliance, it would actually be closer to 4.14%. Now, what's interesting, so the expected range should have been 3.24 to 5.04. Remember, there's that 1% variance that I put in there, or 0.9% variance. But their actual change in the omega-3 index was 1.8. So this study went from 3.79, very low omega-3, to 5.73. And so again, that's the mean difference of 1.41 to 3.21% change should have been. So percent change. And so really the compliance was probably closer to 36 to 56% based on those ranges. So in all reality, the most meaningful conclusion that I can come to with this is that maybe that 4% threshold that's used for cardiovascular research may not be adequate to elicit improved skeletal muscle response from a physiological standpoint. So we probably need to get folks up to 6% or more for that physiology to truly change in a manner that helps them get to a point where they're stronger and potentially more muscle mass. But because of the evidence I showed here, I'm hesitant to say that. So when you're looking at studies, it's really important to look at the quality of the studies, and not just from a design quality, because from a design quality, the study was well done. However, from an omega-3 standpoint, there may be something lacking. Now, there's a couple things I wanted to go back to when we talk about design quality. So typically when we look at a meta-analysis, it's simply that. You look at a meta-analysis and you're like, great, love the results, I'm moving with it. Well, we also have to critically look at meta-analyses, and I want to point out two that are here. Rondinelli and Utina studies that just came out in 2021 and 2024, respectively. There were some issues with both of these meta-analysis that are really important. For example, if you look here, there were 3 separate analyses, 2 on muscle function, which was 4-meter walking test, chair rise time test, and hand grip strength, that for some reason, these standard deviations were not imported into the meta-analysis. So, and why that's so meaningful is because if you look here, they have the total number. This total number vastly influences, because this is a computer system, RevMan's ability, this computer system, to determine, but you don't have you're not able to estimate this. So you're actually changing the results. So whenever I did a reanalysis of this data, thankfully, there were not any significant differences. So if we look here, the original and updated, not a significant difference. For the chair rise time test, not a significant difference. Hand grip strength had the biggest difference. It went from a finding that was favoring the placebo to a finding that was actually favoring omega-3, a change of 0.28 kilograms. But again, not meaningful. That would be approximately, I don't know, just over a pound, a difference of pressure. But more interestingly, whenever this study was published, we wrote a letter to editor titled Fishing in Muddy Waters, Reeling in Methodological Flaws in N3 Fatty Acid Research. The reason why is because this study was very difficult to make meaningful conclusions from the data provided. The studies they used reported pre to post differences with no treatment effects. So they had a control group. So someone taking a placebo, that person conducted a research protocol, as in, well, for the purpose of this, they did a resistance training protocol for 10 weeks. And we measured their outcomes in strength, for example. Well, they took that and they did not compare it to fish oil, which it should be compared. And so what they reported here is really inappropriate. And they also compared different groups, as in what they were eating, for example. So if it was a mixed supplement group, they included that study. And they did not report all the strength measures. So when in our letter to the editor, we actually reanalyzed the data to ensure that each of the analysis was correct by scientific principles. So the first analysis here, as you can see, there was a decrease really from 0.66 to 0.22, which this would be a moderate effect down to a trivial effect. And with the updated analysis included a direct comparison between control group or placebo group versus supplementation group, an appropriate resistance training comparator, and then all the strength outcomes. And then the second one we conducted here, again, not quite significant, favored omega-3 supplementation, but wasn't significant. And this also included only the studies that had appropriate comparators when it came to dietary intervention. And so even though this meta-analysis was published and stated what I believe to be the case, that strength was improved, the issue is that when studies are put together like this, it really does muddy the waters of all the different studies that are put together. And so it makes our ability to make decisions much less. And so I would rather there be a more clear picture for the future. So changing this, we actually get, removing that trial and then making the corrections to the previous meta-analysis. Once again, no big changes overall, but it's just more on the nose, I guess, for what we want to see. Muscle mass was not influenced overall. Look at all the different meta-analyses. Strength was improved in 6 of the 9 trials, and function was pretty equivocal. 3 trials favored omega-3, 3 trials were neutral. So as you can see here, I really do think that if we look at this and how important only 1% improvement is in strength, if you look at the bolded lines here, this is the typical strength curve that we find, and you'll find this in a number of different textbooks. And I made this dotted line of a very slight 1% improvement starting at early age. So think about 18 to 40 and moving on. And this hypothetical curve with increased omega-3 index can actually, that 1% can substantially keep someone above the threshold of disability for a longer time. So I think the finding that omega-3 can influence strength is pretty powerful. So overall key takeaways from this presentation is that EPA and DHA most likely influences protein synthesis and breakdown. However, there are differences with whole body versus myofibrillar. The response may be most effective in clinical populations, but we do need to study that more. And I've ended with that more human research is needed. And despite recent increased omega-3 index across the globe, certain subpopulations like athletes and military still have suboptimal omega-3 status. And overall, omega-3 supplementation does not have an effect on lean body mass overall, but there is a small effect on strength. And again, research quality is an issue, but remember, always measure omega-3 index or some various permutation of that and assess study quality prior to initiating a trial. Thank you guys so much for your time, and I will stand by for questions. And I do have a slide here if you need to reach me.
Jeff, thank you so much. That was fantastic. Just incredible overview of the research and the information in this area. Definitely a unique area, and you did an amazing job providing that. All right. Couple of questions that are available. First question that's coming in is it correct that omega-3 can downregulate COX-2 and TNF, which would mean reducing inflammation?
Yes, there is really good evidence that that is one of the primary functions, especially when we look at, I believe they're was a talk, there is a talk coming up about SPMs. So even further downstream than EPA and DHA, there are some powerful SPMs that come from those that do have a pretty positive effect, especially with EPA. It's a pretty powerful anti-inflammatory agent. It does have an influence on TNF, especially.
And it doesn't reference what paper, but it just asks, was fatigue measured, and then more energy with a question mark.
Oh, that's a good question. So I think that's in reference to the resistance training study that was 10 weeks. No, fatigue was not measured. I will say that it is something that I wish that we would have measured, honestly.
Just to kind of give people an update, we want to thank our co-partners, FARI, the Fatty Acid Research Institute, Carlson Labs, also Nordic Naturals, Yoli, Vivo Mega, Nutraceuticals World, OmegaQuant, and GoEd. Jeff, any future research that you have, that areas explored that you can discuss, or I know some things might be confidential, but I'm just out of curiosity.
Yeah. Yeah. Honestly, from the omega-3 standpoint, there's a couple things on the wing, but nothing official yet. I've been working on a couple things. So they're in the thought process and they're moving forward. So hopefully within the next couple years, we'll have a few more trials complete.
Awesome. Okay. All right. Here's a question that says, what progress do we see with getting the omega-3 into the military? I think that's a great question. Is you presented that information, levels being so low, how do we get their levels up?
I know. So that was part of some unpublished data, but we did submit. So I'm a part of an omega-3 working group within a military context, and we are presenting all of our data to them because the goal will be to look at our current practice, really to do in a full alignment of the current practices across the medical or the military health system to determine how they currently measure the omega-3 index, if it occurs, and if not, to really push testing as we should, because especially in the military, and I didn't even go over any of the cognitive or brain research looking at TBIs or concussions, but there's a lot of reasons why military service members specifically should have higher levels of omega-3. So we are currently exploring avenues to get omega-3, especially the omega-3 index, as a standardized test when folks get into the military. That's our first step. And we're trying to determine in our special populations like special operators, rangers, if we can actually have more consistent testing in those populations that may be exposed to more head trauma and those types of things.
Excellent. Yeah. If you haven't checked out, just search Jeff's name, type in concussion. You'll see some great papers. You can always email me, but I'll probably have an influx. Give me all those papers, because we have a lot of great papers on.
And they can email me as well. I'll send it to them, of course.
Yeah, they have a lot of great. So you have Jeff's email here. So you're about to get 50 emails. Send me all your papers. Awesome. Well, thank you all so much, Jeff. Really appreciate your time. Always great research, great information. I know we'll have you back at some point in the near future presenting, maybe next year, at this topic for another topic related to athletes and sport. Y'all have a great rest of your Wednesday. Take care.